Hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning Data Live 2019. I'm Gretel Kinsey with Scriptorium Publishing, and I'm going to be moderating our sessions this afternoon. This session is Burning It All Down with a QA Strategy presented by my colleague, Jake Campbell. Learning Data Live is brought to you by Scriptorium, the content strategy experts. Since 1997, Scriptorium has helped companies manage, structure, organize, and distribute content in an efficient way. And if you're trying to figure out how the DITA model can best support your content, or you're setting up a DITA system, please contact us. We would love to work with you. LearningData.com and Learning Data Live would not be possible without the help of our sponsors, and we thank them very much and appreciate their support. I want to go over just a few quick housekeeping items and explain how things will work during this session. Attendees are muted during the webcast. However, we still want your input during the session. So please take a moment to locate the questions module in the GoToWebinar interface. You can type your questions here at any time during the session, and our speaker will answer questions at the end. When that question and answer session starts, please look for a link to a session evaluation survey in the questions module. We would very much appreciate your feedback on the sessions. So here's just a brief look at today's schedule. And with that, Jake, I'm going to turn things over to you. So Jake, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, take it away.
Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to Burning It All Down with a QA Strategy. My name is Jake Campbell, and my name's Jake Campbell, and I'm a technical consultant at Scriptorium Publishing. Just a little bit of background about me. I have 3 years of educational software QA experience where I worked on online courses for UNC Greensboro, which included some initiatives for a few game-like courses. And I did a lot of working with professors and other concentration specialists to kind of make sure that the content was right. I also worked at a small game company for 5 years that no longer exists. During my time there, I didn't really work on much of consequence, but one of the games I worked on is still running, so you know, there's something there. But because of my background and the time I've spent at Scriptorium, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we can look at content as more than just a technical manual or a marketing asset. So let's go ahead and just talk about content strategy real quick, because I know there are some sometimes contentious opinions about what content strategy actually means. So for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to say that it focuses on content creation, content publication, and content governance. You know, the way your authors make your content, the way you get your content out to your audience, and how you manage changes to those processes. And really, a good QA strategy is going to touch on all parts of content strategy in that context. After all, you don't just write some topics and throw them out into the wild. So let's go ahead and talk about QA's role in content strategy. When you're thinking about QA, think of it as part doctor, part forensic analyst. Your QA strategy will ideally prevent your content and pipelines from advancing before they're ready. These processes tend to serve as gatekeepers, providing regular checks for people to pop in and go, hey, is this ready? Does it meet our expectations? Is it going to meet our customers' expectations? Do we need to slow down a little bit and just kind of refocus things to make sure that we don't wind up with problems down the line? So let's go ahead and just dive into the thick of things here. We're going to start out by talking about why we need to do QA. Then we're going to talk about some of the overarching types of QA, and then we'll get into the specifics of different types of testing. And then we'll go ahead and talk about what makes a good QA strategy, those actual components that you'll be looking at on your end. So yeah, I mean, the obvious first question, why do we need QA processes? I mean, you know, we've got good teams that we've trusted and we've done well before without a strong structure for this. So why start now? And yeah, that might be true, but it's hard to figure out how to get better in the future if you're not regularly and efficiently checking for improvement across your systems. And that's a big part of QA that I want to focus on. It's not just a way to figure out what's wrong, but also ways you can improve. That's key to understanding why QA isn't just a best practice, it's also good strategy. Because, I mean, it's true, nobody actually wants to spend time and money on figuring out that something doesn't work, but it's better that you spend the time and money to do that now than the alternative, which is your users finding out that something doesn't work. I think the real key here is that content is becoming more complex, connected, and intelligent. It's necessary to treat it less like words on a page and more like a software asset, because as content becomes more intelligent, it actually is becoming more code-like. After all, we have context that gives semantic meaning to things, and those elements that give semantic meaning only really do anything special in output if we decide to do that. So there's the prod name element. It can be bold or italic, or it can have no special formatting, but you can use it as a way to insert specific product names. But that goes a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about here. The key point is that your content is intelligent, so you really should treat it that way, because you're only going to improve your content by challenging it and your processes to be better. So let's talk about processes. And what I mean here by process is just the different roles that QA can serve. I talked a little bit before about how QA touches all the parts of content strategy, from authoring to production and governance. So we're going to talk about the overall processes. So starting us out, there's Copywork, just for lack of a better term. This is the content creation aspect of QA and is pretty much there with the traditional editing process that you think of when you think of, well, how do I check if my content's right? Is your content correct and complete? That kind of thing. It's also important for making sure your content's actually been updated, because after all, you're not always going to have fresh new topics. You're probably going to be updating things in the meanwhile. And it's entirely different to check for the presence of new content versus the updating of previous content. So now it's also important to note that this process isn't entirely manual. There's a few tools and features that you're probably going to have access to. So I think we're all pretty familiar with, the spelling and grammar check that's available in word processors. Some tool vendors might offer similar functionality, but there's also context and consistency checking. There are functions that basically go through and check to make sure that you're using the correct elements in places, or you're using the correct terminology throughout. It helps to actually enforce style guides on the authoring side, rather than having to go through and ensure that everything's consistent through editing. It also kind of branches out into data consistency, though that gets into kind of a more codey technical context. Let's say, for example, that you've just migrated a whole bunch of information from one database to another, and you need to be sure that the content conforms to all of your needs. You can make sure that all the data information is correct by running a script on that, or that all of the tables that you're looking for information in have the same formatting. So for example, say your content team goes to your DBA and wants to fetch information on particular IDs for a particular product line. If one of your tables is using product ID as their ID table, and another one is just using ID, you're not going to get that full range of information. So you're going to get some stuff dropping. So making sure that your actual technical data is consistent is important as well. Let's talk about technical work. This is generally what people think of when they think of QA. Somebody sitting there at a computer, looking over error logs, typing things into a console. But I promise it's much more glamorous than that. But still, this is the part of the process that is focused on, does this thing work? And it tends to look at the moving parts of a production process as opposed to the authoring process, for the most part. There are a lot of tools and testing aids that I could mention, but I mean, there's so many different ways that technical work can branch out that it can get a little out of hand. But generally, if you're looking at tools for technical work, you're looking at things like code debuggers, validity checking systems, general code editors, any kind of thing that you're going to find in an integrated development environment. So now that we've talked about, the content and the code, let's talk about the people. So we're going to talk a little bit about process work. And this is generally a post-mortem process. You know, it comes up at the end of whatever chunk of content you're looking at or you've been working on. It's the people side of things, and it ties in really closely with the concept of governance, which consists of the overarching principles and guidelines that dictate how your content's created and published. So here, we're less concerned with does our content work or does it look good, and more with can we create and publish this content well? You know, think of it as kind of like a management QA. If any of you are familiar with agile workflows or anything like that, this is, you know, the burn down or the retrospective. And it focuses on, you know, were there problems? Can we improve? So when you're looking at process work, it can get very granular. It can either be focused on a specific team or content creation group, or it can focus on a particular set of content, which can be broad as, you know, a specific product or a project. You know, how these things are organized tends to be done on an ad hoc basis, but it's always important to ensure that you do not overcrowd any of these group gatherings. There is such a thing as too many cooks in the kitchen. So I kind of said before, like this process generally focuses on efficiency rather than correctness. So instead of saying, does this work? It tends to be focused on the big picture. You know, how do we do? What went wrong? What were our successes? And I really want to stress here that it's important to focus on both what went wrong and what went well, because you can identify issues that you can act on and identify processes that you might be able to expand out in your organization. You might be able to solve a problem in one area with something that went well in another area. So the kind of things you're going to be focusing here are things like how you can fill gaps. So, you know, is this part of the team, like during this project, did this part of the team struggle because of limited bandwidth? Meanwhile, another related part of the team had people who had available time. Could you get some cross assignments going on or get some collaboration going on to kind of help with that? You know, was there a team that struggled because they couldn't effectively get the information they needed from another team? So how can you improve cohesion between teams? So naturally, because process work on this level is people focused, there's probably going to be some problems because team interaction is going to result in some interesting and very human things, because let's face it, teams have priorities and they aren't necessarily going to align 100% together with one another. And usually this is going to result in external issues. So what we're looking here is actually a tweet that John Cutler started, and you should really give him a look on Twitter. He talks a lot about, you know, product development and process work. It's very interesting. So, you know, if you have retrospectives and there was an issue that's external to your team, how do you resolve them? What can your team do to deal with issues that are external to the team? And one thing is that, you know, there are a lot of different organizational structures like Agile or Kanban, where teams are, well, they try to be segregated from the organizational level of things so they can focus on their work, but they communicate out to a leader who takes those issues to share stakeholders and other teams. So there's generally like a stand-up meeting where it's, you know, daily or every few days where the team addresses issues and they can try to resolve them internally. And if they can't resolve them internally, then it's up to, you know, either the Scrum Master or the tribe leader or whoever is the person who can go to the outside and take those issues up and try and get them resolved at that level. And then there's visibility, because sometimes you can go through your tribe leader or your Scrum Master, but sometimes it needs to be a little bit more publicly visible. Agile and Scrum will tend to have a way to track impediments or days that have been blocked or things like that. Increasing that level of visibility can drive interaction from other teams or other stakeholders in order to help resolve external issues. Of course, you know, maybe something only looks like it's an external issue. I mean, maybe you aren't getting what you need from that other team, but you need to be sure, are the lines of communication from your team to them also open? Are they getting what they need to know that you need something from them? And I mean, again, we're talking about people here, so sometimes you just need to accept that you can't really do anything about external issues. At this point, you need to either know that it's coming and plan accordingly, because these have been things that you've seen in the past, or just try and work around the problem as best you can. Remember, this is the people side of the equation. You can't really solve people the way you can solve a code issue. So we've talked about different aspects of what makes up QA and how it gets handled. So now we're going to talk about the different types of actual testing work, because you can't just check a box off and say something's ready to ship. So we're going to start with positive testing. This is the kind of thing that most people think of when it comes to testing. It's, you know, a binary, does this work or doesn't this work question. It's generally the first kind of testing that gets done before it moves on for further testing. And it's important to note that this doesn't actually try to break anything. Also, do not let this be the only kind of testing that you do. So on the flip side of positive testing is negative testing. It asks whether something breaks as opposed to whether something works. And it does this by actively attempting to find failure points in whatever feature you're checking. It's important because this is the most likely way to root out weird issues that won't arise in standard use. Because while your authors or your users probably aren't going to actively try and break things, you can account for all human behavior and all different configurations of software, whatever situations external to the code that you're going to be finding. So you might be asking yourself at this point, okay, yeah, but how does this apply to content? It's not like your authors are going to purposefully write things wrong, and most systems are going to have catches in place to say, hey, this isn't right, you need to fix it. So yes, content models are constrained, but they might not fully encompass a user's needs. Sometimes you need to check and see if something is allowed that shouldn't be allowed because it wasn't actually captured in the initial round of requirements. Or can you leave something out of the required content model? Just because you have the DTD in place doesn't necessarily mean that works 100%. I know that there have been several times in the past when I've built out a content model for a client only for authors to discover in testing that they needed something that wasn't accounted for, or they were doing something that, you know, actually makes sense and is valid, but it, you know, it isn't a best practice or isn't supported by the client style guide. So we've actually had to use that information to go back and, you know, patch these things and make sure that this kind of behavior doesn't occur. So when you're doing negative testing, you're definitely going to be coming up on a lot of different problems, and because it tries to break things. So in an ideal world, you would just fix all of them. That's fine, but you're probably on a schedule. You're going to need to track issues, prioritize them, and make sure that they get resolved in a timely and efficient manner. So, you know, we'll actually get into how to do that a little later. And then there's stress testing. This is honestly going to be more on the IT and production side, but it's good to cover this just because it can touch some of the content side of things in the end. But this is going to cover things like making sure that your servers can handle the load of all of your authors accessing your cloud-based authoring tools, or being sure that your server can handle publishing your content. So no, you probably can't run content through your system if there's a rel table with 100,000 entries. And honestly, it's probably just going to run for an hour or two before crashing with an out of memory error. And this is really important because knowing the limitations of your system is going to help inform you on your needs. You know, if you thought that you could get away with a 100,000 entry rel table and it turns out you can't, you need to completely pivot and figure out how you can get that down, or another way to get your related information in there. More on the development side of things is module testing. It's specifically, does this feature work? It tests it in a vacuum And it's important that you need to take this into account, because even if it's really only developers that are going to do it, you need to build time into your project timeline estimates for this kind of testing. I've seen a lot of timelines get blown because somebody put in an estimate for how much time it would take to develop, but they only accounted for the actual development time, not the testing time. Then there's regression testing. So occasionally you're going to have big updates. So you're either going to be updating your DTDs to make things more efficient, but not change things immediately, or you're going to have database changes on your back end, or you've gone through and just rebranded everything. So you need to be sure that things still work. So what a regression test is taking your content and basically going through the whole thing to make sure, does everything still work the way it should? You should really think of it as kind of a physical for your content. And the primary questions you're going to be looking at are old problems still fixed? And are there any new issues? This might seem kind of minor since hopefully you've done your testing up to this point, but keep in mind that outside of module testing and positive testing, the real area where issues tend to arise is when features interact. So yeah, regression testing is daunting. It's basically a thorough look across a generally large set of your content. So depending on the size of the project you're looking at or the scope of what you change, it can be a very time-consuming process. So the important thing is that you want to have a way to keep track of what needs testing, what the results were, who did the testing, and when. This is important because it's going to give you a history of when things break, and that can really help with testing in the future, because you can refer back to previous testing and say, okay, we know it was working at this point and it stopped working at this point, so something happened there that we can focus on. As far as how to keep track of these things, that's entirely up to you. Do you want to use a spreadsheet on a shared drive or a cloud drive or just a document? Maybe you've got something else, but the important thing is that your regression testing document needs to be a living document that grows as your project grows with it. So on the lighter side of things, there's smoke testing. Think of it as a lesser regression test after you do something relatively minor, like a server reconfiguration or reset, or doing a content refactor on a smaller chunk of stuff in your pipeline. Yeah. The key thing here is that if there's no smoke, there's probably no fire. You can track this with a checklist, kind of the same as with regression testing, but it's going to be a whole lot less detailed. You're probably still going to have some overlap between these two documents though, and that's not unusual. And it's actually not unusual to use one to inform the other when you're setting up your initial test runs. So there's all these different kinds of testing. The important thing is that you still need to do the testing. If you have test procedures set up, but then you don't follow those procedures, well, then that's, yeah. The important thing to take away here is that you need to build your testing procedures into your project timelines. Nothing ever goes 100% according to plan. And I've seen issues cascade out into other things that have resulted in being very glad that, you know, there's some extra time on there for testing and for resolving the results of testing. So we've talked about the different kinds of testing. So let's talk about the parts of QA strategy that are actually going to perform and aid in that testing. The kind of things we're going to be talking about here are the people who do the testing, any kind of software that can aid in testing, and assets that you can use during your testing. So let's go ahead and start out by talking about people. I mean, test automation is fantastic. It can do a lot of repetitive work that, you know, people might glaze over or miss a few things in because you stare at a screen long enough, you're going to miss something. But the thing about automated testing is it can't make intelligent decisions like people can. People are going to be your best arbiters of whether something is missing or not. And as far as people go, there's a couple different kinds of testing that they can do. So there's self-testing. Naturally, if somebody's doing some development, they're going to read over their own content or test their own features. This tends to be the first kind of testing that gets done, but you need to make sure that it's not the last. On the other side of self-testing, there is peer testing. You made something and you're pretty sure it works, but there are a lot of factors that you might not be accounting for, like your machine setup, the set of content you're working with, that kind of thing. This is generally going to be done by power users or other developers or subject matter experts who know exactly what needs to be done. And this is incredibly important to help mitigate the effects of what I call developer myopia. If you've been working on a feature or you've been working on a chunk of content for so long, eventually it becomes very difficult to actually see everything that's there. So it's always good to get a second set of eyes on it. Then there's software. So human testing is great, but we aren't perfect. And like I said before, testing can be a daunting prospect. So having tools on hand to help out is a great idea. So a lot of development tools tend to have features built in. For example, Oxygen has a content audit function that lets you look across a set of files to see what kind of elements are present. So if you know that you absolutely do not want, for example, an I element in your content, you can run a content audit across your file set and it'll return a report that tells you how many there are and where you can find them and then flag them for fixing. Then there's Antenna House, which is an FO formatter used to create PDFs that has a pixel by pixel comparison tool. And what you would use that for is if you have your content set and it's the same, but the primary difference is that you have changed some of the formatting, like you've changed your margins or something like that, you can run it through, check the PDFs against each other, and then it will just check and be sure that everything is physically the same. Because you might want to go through and make sure that everything's in the same place, because you don't want something falling off into your bleed area for the print run, but you also don't want to go through 500 pages of content with a ruler. And we've got review transforms. Content reviewers, they can't necessarily check all the content that gets created. Sometimes you're going to have content that is scattered throughout a big manual, so it's going to be difficult for them to go through and find all the content easily. Other times you're going to have draft data content or other XML content that isn't readily user-friendly. It's not really human readable, and it's difficult for your authors and the people who are checking it to be sure that it fits all of your criteria. And the thing here is that, yes, the Ditto OT can output PDFs, it can output websites, but it can also be used to generate test output. So let's go ahead and take a look at a little bit of a problem we have. So we've got a large amount of strings that are stored in Ditto, and you can't easily review them in a single place, either because it would generate a tremendous guide or it's difficult to just read flat Ditto content. You can create a review transform that outputs a PDF that collects strings into one place and formats them in a way that makes it straightforward to go through and identify problems. So let's go ahead and take a look at just a couple strings that we've got here. We've got a couple strings for a caution window for the Widgetron 620 here. Up top, we've got something that's already been approved, and down below, we've got some content that is being checked to be sure that it works. And you can see right here, we have a max length attribute that says 60. So our maximum length on this is 60 characters. Generally, you're going to see these kinds of things because they need to fit in a specific amount of space, or you're working on like a tablet or phone display. So you want to be sure that it fits within a specific window. So if you look at this, okay, yeah, I guess it looks fine. It's anybody who's going to be reviewing this is going to have a heck of a time, counting the individual characters in here to be sure that the string actually matches that string length. So what we can do is we can create a tabular output to collect all of this information together with a couple quality of life things. So we could create something that outputs this. Instead of just staring at text on a page, it actually puts it out in a table. So what we have here is the associated image that we can use to say, okay, yes, we have the correct up-to-date image that's there. Then we have the text of the string, which, okay, yes, that looks fine. And then we have a length comparison, which actually counts the string size and then compares it to the maximum. And if everything is fine, it does nothing to it. But you can see on the second one here that the length attribute is actually in red because the string length is over the amount that they need. And this actually makes it much easier for someone who's reviewing this content to say, oh, okay, we need to bounce this back and get them to reduce the string length. And then there's legacy content. So, okay, we've got legacy content that we're pulling down from a web page or FrameMaker or InDesign or something like that into DITA. And we want just a quick check to ensure that it conforms to standards. A review transform can apply specific formatting to legacy elements to indicate that something got missed in previous rounds of testing or to flag first pass content for fixes later. So let's say that we've pulled down some information on the Widgetron 620 and we want to check and see what needs fixing right now. So here's our output. So as you can see, we've got some stuff that's in italics and it's all highlighted in red. So what we have here is our style guide says that we want to have our product names italicized because we want to keep that from what we had before. But we don't want to use the italic element. We want to use the prod name element. So what the legacy review can do is find all of the italics, italicize them, but also change the font color to red to just quickly flag, hey, there's content here on the DITA side that needs to be checked. Because if we take this and we look over here, all the stuff that's in italics is in I's, but we want those things to be wrapped in prod name. And then there's the many over there, which, that's not a prod name. And maybe we do want to keep it in italics, or we might say in our style guide that we want to avoid using italics outside of product names. So we could flag that for just removing the I tag or restructuring that piece of content. Now there's ticket systems. I talked a few times before about the fact that you need to organize and track issues, and this is what's going to do it for you. It provides a lot of functionality like tracking issue histories, clarifying who's responsible for what, allowing for users to, hand issues off to other people so that problems don't fall through the cracks. Someone at every point is going to be responsible for handling this issue. And the real beauty of ticket systems is that there's a lot of different systems that can suit your needs. There are hosted solutions, there are standalone things that you'll host on your own, and they have a lot of features that allow you to organize things on varying levels of granularity. You can organize ticket sets by project. A lot of systems have a way to group tickets under a project, which helps keep things organized and also allows individual teams to have their own ticket groupings, which can help with keeping your team infrastructure moving along. It can also be process-based. And what I mean by process-based is that there are some ticket systems that can incorporate Agile, Kanban, or other project management schemes. I've actually seen it be a really big help to clients who have, gone into a ticket system that allows them to build out a Kanban board or a Scrum board for working with their teams. In addition to these things, there are also filtering options to allow users to keep track of things that apply to them so that they don't get overwhelmed. Then there's wikis. That's a more colloquial term, but in general, we're talking about systems that allow for high-level narrative organization and allows for file sharing across the organization. The big thing that you're going to get here is that decisions are going to get put down in stone where everybody can get at them with a record of who said it, when, and hopefully why. There have been a lot of projects I've been on where a well-maintained wiki kept the information in one place, so I didn't have to go chase down, a developer or a shareholder or an author so that I could figure out what needed to be done or why. And if there's something wrong in the wiki, make note of it. You're going to take that to the burn down. And then there are test sets. When you test something, you're naturally going to have something to test on. Ideally, you're going to have actual project content to work with, but sometimes you're going to have to supplement that set of content because maybe it's not available right now because it hasn't been authored or it hasn't gone through the conversion yet. Or maybe the test set that you do have is so small that you need to add additional test cases to verify. And that's fine. You can create dummy content, your general lorem ipsum kind of stuff, or you can copy chunks of real content to make some frankintent. The important thing is that you need to have content that covers as much of your different kinds of content as possible. Ideally, you're going to be using all of the elements and topic types that you have so you have a single document to check. But you also want to be sure that the test set you have that you're working with is modular. And the way you do that is by keeping branches of content within maps so that you can readily comment them out if you don't need to test what's in them. For example, if you're going and only testing task content behavior, you don't need to generate any other topic types that happen to be in your test set. I've had full bore test sets before that have taken upwards of 30 minutes to run, and you really want to avoid that kind of thing unless it's absolutely necessary. You also want to make sure that your test content is easily navigable because, as I've said, it can get pretty large. And the way I do that is by using what I call navigation hooks. It's really just like a short string that I insert somewhere that is not going to turn up in a search anywhere else. So I just use my initials, or some people use, an uncommon string of letters like X, Y, Z, Z, Y. But the key is just to have something that you can easily jump down to what you're testing to decrease the amount of time that you're spending scrolling through your content looking for something. But the important thing here is that, yes, you have all these tools and they're great. The big thing, much like testing though, is that if you have these tools, you need to actually make use of them and use them right. Did something go wrong with anything here? Make note of it because you're taking that to the burn down. Just burn it all down. At the end of the day, QA means tough love. I think the most important thing to take away though is that there are a lot of tools and methods to work with, but they're not magic. It's up to you and your team to maintain the organization and discipline to apply these concepts and make them work for you. They're flexible, but they're still work. So yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up here. So QA, it's not just something that's done, in the caverns of Cobol and the fortress of Fortran, where a wizened graybeard in a basement does code magic at a terminal window. Everybody can do it, and like it or not, because QA touches every part of the content process, everyone's a part of it at some level. And remember, your content's intelligent, so you have to identify potential issues with it intelligently in order to get the most out of it. Okay, and that's all we've got. So I think we've got some time here for some questions.
Yes, we do. So thank you very much for that presentation, Jake. And for those of you who've been watching, if you have any questions, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, please locate that questions module in the GoToWebinar interface, and you can type your questions there. I do also want to just briefly mention before we get into the Q&A session that we are going to drop a link in that questions module as well for our evaluation survey. So we would really appreciate it if you could fill that out for us. We really would like your feedback on our sessions. And if you have any questions, just feel free to drop them on in. I'm going to start by asking Jake, about the people side of QA strategy, which you touched on in your presentation. And so this question is, what happens when you have been in one content system where there wasn't really a focus on QA and it wasn't really a big part of your strategy, and now you're getting into a new content strategy and new system where you're going to be making QA a priority? How would you manage the issue of not really having QA knowledgeable people on staff?
So I think at that point, the important thing is that at that point, you definitely realize that QA is a priority. So you've probably gone and at least asked yourself, what do we need to check? What are our goals when we're performing our QA and when we're analyzing our content for correctness and trying to get everything straight? So the important thing is to first off, set expectations for your team. Say, we're going to need to be doing regular testing on our content, whether that means validating the actual content itself to make sure that it's complete and correct, or whether you're auditing the output of your content to be sure that it's conforming to the needs that you have for your content once you produce it. You just need to let people know what's expected, and there's going to be some bumps, like every time. That's very common that I've seen, like whenever we've implemented a new processes, people need to get used to the process. But the beauty of it is that it is a very structured process. Something gets completed, it gets handed off to somebody, and the expectations are there, so they know what to do with it. And then eventually it just starts to work once people have gotten the hang of it.
And a follow-up question to that, because you did mention there will be some bumps. How do you balance the learning curve of that kind of a staff that hasn't focused on QA alongside everything else that they're going to have to learn when they go into a new content system?
So at that point, I think one of the important things would be being able to look back at prior projects that the team has worked on and identifying places where it could have gotten better. At its core, QA is about iterative learning and figuring out how you can continually improve on your processes. So as long as your team has some experience and you're able to articulate and realize why something may not have gone well in the past, it's going to give people a frame of reference that allows them to see, okay, this is where we're going and this is how we can improve.
Another question, what is your attitude according to risk assessment and management?
So, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm kind of thinking the tack to take on this is kind of like when you're developing something, when you're developing something new, you kind of have to take into account the fact that there might be some problems down the road with it that might set you back a little bit as far as how to actually kind of budget time in there. Is that the kind of direction that you were thinking for that question?
I'm not sure if the person who asks it wants to follow up, but I think just from kind of my own perspective, I know that I've dealt with some clients that have, risk management or risk assessment specific content. And so it may be, something along the lines of how to address that as part of your QA strategy.
Okay, so yeah, generally the way I approach any kind of risk management when it comes to new projects or new features is to kind of look at, do I know of anything that has done this in the past? Have we done anything similar? And have we run into any kind of problems with something similar? From there, I can kind of get an understanding, kind of what I refer to as the shape of the problem, and get a feeling for, is this going to be difficult or is this going to be relatively straightforward? From there, I can kind of build out the concept of, okay, these features, I can definitely know how to get them to work, and there should be a limited amount of issues in implementing them. Versus, okay, we can definitely do this, but it's going to take some time and there's going to be a lot of like recursive testing to make sure that things work properly. And utilizing that kind of approach, seeing how new and level of effort something is going to take, just kind of use that to figure out, should we approach this now, or should we table it for, say, a pilot project that we can use to get a better grasp on something if there's a little bit too much unknown about that process.
Another question, you've touched on the idea of legacy content during your presentation, and I kind of want to just talk about that a little bit and how you can, if you are converting a large amount of legacy content, maybe from something unstructured into a structure like DITA for the first time, how can you set up a QA process to manage that entire conversion? Because I know there tend to be a lot of issues with that.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, one of the first projects that I worked on when I came to work for Scriptorium was a very large migration of legacy content from an unstructured environment into DITA. And I came in kind of in the middle of that, but the team had already put together a pretty good workflow for how to get things going, because basically there were large chunks of DITA content. So we would download basically an entire book that could span anywhere between 300 and 500 pages, full of images and varying different kinds of content. But we had identified some things that we knew were going to be a little weird. Basically, all tables were the way the tables had been set up, the column widths had gotten like borked or turned sideways somehow. So we had basically like a script for what you would do when you pull down a new package. So step one, declare that you're grabbing a package from the share so that nobody else would start working on the chunk of content that you were pulling down. Then you would open up that chunk of content and immediately go in there, and the first thing you would do is run a search and replace that would go in and fix all of the tables so that they would be, readable and able to be edited. Then there was a common set of checklists that said tasks tend to have these problems. Find tasks and then do these things to them to make sure that they're all correct. And it's basically, like I said, the process I was talking about for regression testing is have a checklist, know things that are common that you need fixed, go in and fix them. And then after you had done that, do a quick smoke test to run through and make sure that, something weird hadn't happened with something.
Yeah, and I think it's just important to highlight that when you are going from most legacy formats into something like DITA, it's almost never going to be a perfect conversion. You're almost always going to have some sort of QA intervention to make sure that everything comes across cleanly, especially if it hasn't been written topic-based, anything like that. So.
Yeah, definitely. Again, people are going to be the best arbiters of, is this wrong and is something missing? So it's always important to try and build in that human element.
All right, another question here. Can you explain the pixel by pixel comparison in more detail? I believe this is in reference to the antenna house feature that you mentioned.
Yeah, so basically what it does, so if you're familiar with the concept of a file diff where it just goes line by line and flags lines that have something different, it's the same concept, except what it basically does is it just kind of overlays one over the other and then flags any spaces where like it's different, just pixel by pixel, just to make sure that everything is the same. So yeah, it's pretty much just a file diff, but to make sure that your PDFs 100% look the same.
All right. And for those of you watching, if you have any more questions, we've still got a few minutes left if you want to pop those into the questions area. I also want to mention, if you come up with a question that you think of later, you can send that to experts@learningdata.com. and we will get back to you with a response on that. Another thing I do want to mention as well is that Jake and I will be hosting a question and answer session tomorrow to wrap up our Learning to the Live event. So that's going to be the last session slot tomorrow, February 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Got another question coming in. What are the risks of limiting a QA effort to a product manager doing ad hoc testing? For example, ad hoc testing a content area for new features of a product within a sprint.
So the big thing with limiting your QA is that you're going to wind up with relatively little in the way of gatekeeping as far as making sure that everything's done. Now, I do want to stress that you don't necessarily need to get like a full team in on this. If this is doing some quick ad hoc testing just to make sure that something is going before it moves on to the next part of the pipeline and it can get tested there, that's not necessarily bad, because remember, QA is a part that goes through the entire production pipeline, and everything has a chance to be checked at every point, and it really should be at least have someone look at it as it goes by. But yeah, the biggest risk, I think, is just that, you know, one person, depending on how much you're doing this, you could wind up just, you know, regular human error or fatigue or something just creeping in and something getting through the cracks is the biggest issue that I see in my mind.
All right, so with that, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we can go ahead and wrap things up.